Bernard, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Robert, and welcome everybody. Well, big topic. I was just prior to the beginning of this, I was talking with Robert a little, and something came up this morning as I was reading a response I gave to someone that is here in the meeting, actually, Chris Scheid, some years ago, in a group where we were active, both Robert and I and a number of other people, including Chris. At some point, Chris brought up the question, in his own words, was, what are some of the useful things one can do? Yeah, obviously that question is bound to come up. It's one of the famous questions that is bound to come at some point to people, you know. It's like we see those guys, you know, people like Robert or whoever, you know, the Buddha, and they seem to be in a groovy enough space, you know. So at some point it's like, yeah, but how, you know, how do I get there? How, you know, how does it happen? Whatever I may say is what worked or works for me. It's obvious to me that this is one of those highly personal matters. One man's medicine is another poison, they say. Fair enough. Another relevant saying is one attributed to Buddha that goes something like, truth is that which works. I like that. It's practical, down to earth. Works for me. Truth is that which works. So that's a crucial point. We all need to find what works for us, what rings right for our own heart, our own mind. It's our own life after all, no one else's. And if we don't take that to heart, no one will for us. Then there's the issue that there are so many paths, so many approaches to reality that human beings came up with, each with their own take on it and the methodology and practice that follow. Unless we happen upon one of them that rings a bell for us from the start and remains with us from then on, that's something that can be quite puzzling, if not confusing, especially nowadays. I'd like to add, you know, in this day and age where everything is so much easily available because of the internet and all this, it's even more puzzling and can be confusing. And actually, I've came across a lot of people that are quite confused because they sample a little of this path and they sample a little of that path and they listen to this teacher and that teacher and that teacher. And they don't say the same thing. You know, this is one of the, for me, immature thing that one may think that, oh, well, they're all talking about the same thing. Well, sorry, sure, you could say, you know, they're all talking about spirituality, but they're not talking about the same realization. The realization of a Buddhist of emptiness is very different from the realization of love, let's say, of a Sufi. Now, that raises a few essential questions. We can talk of some useful things one can do, but about what exactly? What's the usefulness for? What is it all about? If each view holds a piece of reality, as it were, what about the whole thing? Once we realize to a degree or another what reality is, that reality is the whole thing, would we draw a line anywhere and say, this is it? Can we? Personally, I could never do it, though I would try about, you know, useful things one can do. We thought that it would be about spiritual practice work. One first thing I can say is, for me, since quite a while by now, I cannot separate psychological work from spiritual work. I cannot separate the two because more and more my experience shows that they are not separate. Let's take a simple example. Let's say I'm dealing on a psychological level with issues around the presence and absence of love. Yeah, that's a famous one. A lot of human beings seems to be the planet of the loving beings, planet Earth, you know, love, love, love. And it's understandable enough given what love, you know, what love is and lovable qualities and all that. So somebody is dealing with the presence of absence of love in his life. Well, in my own experience and understanding and seeing it in others too, you could, some people separate the two fields, you know, you can work on the ego self on a psychological level around the presence and absence of love. So you go into your past and then you start to, you know, unearth all kinds of things that happened around that. You know, your mother was so absent, so you didn't get the love you need and all that. And the more you see through those things, it creates a space to start to see that those things happen and that created all the pain around the absence of love. And then you might cry and you can work just on the psychological side of things. In the same way, you can work just on the spiritual side of things. And actually you have some teachers and teachings that say that you know, they're not even interested in working on the psychological side, because they say, for example, that love is an aspect of being. So just realize your being as love and that will settle things. But in my own experience and understanding, they're not two separate things, because there's a possibility of working with the psychological material to a point where you go deeper and deeper and you see through self-images related to your past experience, and they get more and more transparent, and slowly a space open up where finally love can manifest. So we might go more into that, but that's something very basic for me since a good number of years by now, that I don't see those two fields as separate. I don't see anything as separate anymore, to tell the truth. So we're talking generally here. So back to what I was reading. In my experience, it's useful to do some groundwork on those levels. How much? That varies for each person, and it's for each to feel that out. This is about opening, loosening things up, easing them off, and bringing about more of their natural movement. So what we're talking about here is about doing some groundwork into loosening the heart, loosening the vitality, loosening the body. And I see so many people, they cannot even cry, you know, when they feel like crying. They cannot be angry when they're actually feeling angry. They cannot shake in fear when they're actually afraid. I mean, the natural response of the body when you're afraid is you shake. You look at any animal, when he's afraid, he's shaking. Or suddenly your whole body starts to shake because it starts to release all the accumulated trauma and all the fear that was there that was not allowed to move. When the fear is allowed to move, it shakes. When anger is allowed to move, you become red hot. You know, the breathing starts to go faster and you start to feel all this energy coming up. When sadness or grief or pain, you know, in the sense of sadness comes up, well, you just start to cry, and then you feel, you know, this gentleness and vulnerability come to your heart. And if you open more to the heart aspect, compassion starts to become more compassionate, more vulnerable, you know. And we're not even talking yet about spiritual practice, which was the main theme that, you know, we said this meeting would be about. But I really feel that there's some groundwork that could be useful for most people, especially Westerners. I think each culture can be a little different, and again, it's very individual. It's very individual. Like if I look at my story, I come from a big family. I was one of the last ones. Somehow my mother was so busy that to a level, it's like I had no mother, because there were 7 children in the family and I'm the last one. So imagine you come in a family and the house is full of people. You come in and and there's no room for you really, and there's not, mom is so busy that it's like, and I became quite close to her in her last years, and it was so touching. At some point she said she was realizing that she could have been more of a friend to her children. And like she was 84, and it's just beautiful the things she realized in the last couple of years of her life. And one of those things was that suddenly she was looking back at her life and seeing, wow, I could have been more intimate with my children. But she was so busy that, yeah, so in a way I didn't. And my father, he was that old generation, serious man, lost in his work. So it's like I never had a father. So, that's my reality of my upbringing. Somebody else had loving parents who were quite, wonderful, and they were really there for them. And so they didn't get that damaged, emotionally. And if you get damaged emotionally, then you repress it. If you repress it, your whole consciousness goes down, your whole energy goes down. I just said something very important, that each time we repress anything in ourselves, we're not just repressing an energy or an emotion, we're narrowing down our awareness, our consciousness. And that could be, in a sense, one of the worst outcome of repression. You're not just repressing an emotion or an energy, you're actually narrowing down your awareness and your consciousness. So what happens to somebody who lived in a situation, in an environment where he had to repress himself a lot? Well, he ends up with a very little consciousness, very little awareness, not just very little emotions, capacity to be alive feeling-wise, not just a little energy, but consciousness-wise, awareness-wise. And then he becomes an adult, and then he meets spiritual teachers, and then they tell him, wake up, and they tell him, you are that, and all that. But there's this tiny bit of awareness that is receiving this message. And what can it do? It's like it's not just the energy or the heart or the emotion that is kind of fast asleep. The awareness itself by now has narrowed down, it became unconscious. And we say that in psychology. I don't live something, so I repress it, so it became part of the unconscious. So same thing happens with the presence, with the awareness, with the consciousness. It's narrowed and narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. And you end up with functioning with just this little bit of consciousness, little bit of awareness. But then there's also, a big part of also waking up is about cognition. And what is this word? I always have it. For some reason, Robert will help me with that. What's the word? Epistemology? Is that the right word?
Yeah, that's it. Epistemology.
Right. Yeah, which is the science of knowledge and how we get to cognize things, knowing and reification, right?
Yes, it's a study of what can be known and how it can be known.
Right. So that's also a big part. So I was writing there. I also found that understanding some things about the structure of the personality or the ego self, its nature, how it develops, can help a good deal. Studying some of the discovery of psychology, like that of ego developmental psychology and object relations school of thought, was very helpful for me. So that's another thing, I find in my own path that it was very helpful to study some of the finding of psychology and ego developmental psychology and epistemology, how all that goes. So, useful things to do. We can talk about the body, we can talk about vitality or energy, we can talk about the heart and emotion, we can talk about cognition and epistemology. And we're not even yet addressing spiritual practice as such, which is a whole field in itself. I personally, I say I don't see a separation between psychology and spirituality. I don't see a separation between spiritual and material. It's not even relevant for me anymore to say this is spiritual. I mean, it is what it is, this all mind-blowing reality. Call it what you want. and making a division into spiritual and material, or psychological and spiritual. It's really a duality that the human mind invent. It can have its usefulness. So now, we brought up the topic here about spiritual practice. We've got to call it something, I guess, but really it's all of one piece to me. So enough as an introduction. I thought it would be shorter than that, Robert, but here we are.
Well, no worries. It's always interesting to hear what you have to say, Bernard. Well, I want to respond by agreeing wholeheartedly with something that you said, which is that whatever one has to say about life pertains to that person and can never be a generality that will fit everyone. Which to me implies that no one can actually help you to awaken. No one can actually help you to awaken. Whatever another human being may experience or believe is not some kind of universal truth. It's a point of view. Naturally, some points of view are very much more useful or valuable than others. I don't mean that listening to the Buddha and listening to Donald Trump will take you to the same place. Clearly not. So we do have to discern and distinguish. However, when we promote anyone, I say, whether it's the Buddha or Robert Saltzman, and thank you for bracketing me with the Buddha, Bernard, that's high praise. I'll get to that in a moment. Whenever we elevate someone, Jesus Christ or the Buddha or Lao Tzu or whoever it may be, into the infallible expert, we become deluded. Right at that point, we are deluded. The words of the Buddha or the words of Robert Saltzman, for that matter, may help you. I think things that I've said have helped others. But eventually, each one of us must find our own way in our own way. This seems clear. Now, I usually avoid speaking autobiographically, but I think after listening to you, Bernard, talking about your experiences with psychotherapy and such, I think I should relax that rule a bit. And I will speak autobiographically. I was practicing spiritually and philosophically in a way, but what I was practicing really had very little to do with the actual experience of awakening. And I think that's important to understand. We all have a kind of carrot in front of us when we're seeking spiritually, and we imagine that if I could get a bite of that carrot, that would just take care of everything. But that's really not what it was like for me. I was sitting in my pickup truck on the edge of the Rio Grande Gorge. I lived in Taos, New Mexico at the time. And this is just a beautiful vista. This is an incredible landscape. And there's nothing there. I was alone. And quite suddenly, I became aware that all of this was just here, including Robert, and that Robert had nothing to do with it. It was just here. I wasn't doing anything. And this is what you call no doer. This is a common trope in spirituality. There's no doer, or no person really exists, or whatever, however that is put. Well, this came as a complete shock to me, and I've written about this elsewhere. It took days and days for me to stop laughing and to calm down and to get back into ordinary consensual reality. I didn't really know how to make sense of that experience. I did a lot of reading to see what others who had similar experiences thought about it and all of that. And gradually, I was able to own some of that. And then I became ill, very ill. This was the first attack of an illness from which I'm suffering now, but I've got it under control with medication. But this was about a year of, a little more than a year of really terrible suffering on the physical level. And during that time, I tried everything I could to deal with this illness. There was no cure for it, no known cure. And I tried everything. One of my Native American friends from the Taos Pueblo gave me some mud from the sacred lake and told me I should eat some of that every day. And I did. I ate mud every day. This is an example of what you call desperation to survive, I guess. Well, another thing I did was consult a naturopath. And this was a young guy, about 10 years younger than I was at the time. And he was taking my history. And I was explaining to him what I was going through. And I looked into his eyes and I saw this amazing compassion, amazing, beautiful compassion just coming out of this guy's face. And at that moment, almost as if someone had spoken this in my ear, what I heard was, "That's what you should be doing, Robert." And I understood that to mean not doing naturopathic healing. I was a photographer at the time. I had no training or understanding of that, really. Not naturopathic healing is what I should be doing, but compassion. It was a real wake up that I had been living selfishly. And even though I felt bright and I was a recognized artist and had a nice life in many ways, it was empty. It was really empty, because when you do not feel others in the depth of your heart, you're only partially alive. Now, at that point, I was faced with a dilemma, because the world of artist, photographer is a highly competitive situation. There's a lot of people who want to be known as a photographer. And so I was involved in this world where everyone is saying, "No, me, no, look at my stuff, no, me." And everybody's pushing and trying to get exhibition space and get into the museum show and whatever it is. And I was part of that. And after I saw this truth about compassion, I just couldn't continue with it. It stopped. Not that I didn't want to continue with it, I actually wanted to continue with it, but when I tried, it didn't work. I could not get it up anymore. And at that point, I fell into a kind of despair or depression, I guess. It's when you see emptiness and you don't know how to fill it. And it occurred to me that I had been reading psychology for 20 years. I was very familiar with the great ones like Freud and Jung and all that. And I was interested in psychotherapy, although I'd never had any. And I decided that I would go back to school and get some degrees and change careers from photographer to psychotherapist. And that's what I did. And so that began a 20-year experience of being a psychotherapist to hundreds of people. What I became aware of in doing that work is the universality of suffering. There is no one you know who isn't suffering in one way or another. No one. And, you know, Bernard said, well, people regard Robert as, you know, he's in some kind of cool state like the Buddha. That's true. I consider myself awake. And that's what Buddha means. It means awakened one. And I don't really see any difference between me and the Buddha. And when I say that, Many people will say, oh my God, what an ego trip. This is, how can you speak that way? This is this great person. And you're, well, he's dead and I'm alive. So I've got that going for me, for one thing. but it's not a claim. It's actually a meltdown. It's a recognition of powerlessness, which is what the Buddha said. There's a famous story. The Buddha's sidekick asks him, he says, oh, awakened one, and you see, that is the thing that I think a lot of people, when they regard someone like me, who really is happy, despite the suffering, despite the limitations, despite the death, all of this. But the cat somehow, the balls are in the air. You know, how does that happen? It happens when you realize that you are powerless, that all of this is unfolding, including oneself. It's a realization. Now, I don't know how to make someone realize that. I have no idea. And that's why I say I'm not a spiritual teacher. I'm not a spiritual teacher. If someone comes to me and says, Robert, educate me spiritually, all I can really say is, you're not doing this. If you realize that, the work will be done.